Is it time for a name shift? If you don't know what that means, then join me, your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, on the Dismantling Doctrine podcast. Formerly known as the Mind Shift podcast, it's time for a change. And if you're someone who's looking to rebuild their life after dismantling whatever doctrine may have controlled you, then this show is for you. I'm really happy to be speaking today with Sarah McCammon. She's the author of a book that's called the Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. So welcome, Sarah, to the Dismantling Doctrine podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me.
I'm super happy to be talking to you because, as I was saying before we hit record, just reading through the email that your publicist sent to me, I don't know, it was a couple months ago when we were trying to set this interview up. Obviously, your book has a lot of resonance with my story because I'm an Exvangelical. But then reading through a little bit about your backstory growing up and leaving the church, covering the Trump campaign, and that was kind of one of the last straws. I thought, this is so much like my story. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, and I want to be clear about one thing. Like for me, covering the Trump campaign wasn't a last straw. Actually, one reviewer said that, and it's I don't know if he didn't read the whole book, but it really was my own deconstruction, if you want to use that word, predated 2016 by many years. But I think after 2016, I started seeing more people having these kinds of conversations out in the open about this experience, and that was what made me want to write the book. So, but yeah, I mean, I deconstructed a long time ago. Again, I never used that word until I started seeing it on the internet, but I think it's one that would apply to me and to so many people, which is why I wanted to write about it.
It's very empowering, isn't it, when you realize, like you said, there are so many people out there. You know, one of the biggest things, when I started deconstructing, I'm like you in the sense that I was deconstructing years before the Trump campaign. But when I saw the white evangelical support for him, it was quite shocking, the dissonance, that I was feeling. And I thought, man, what's going on here? And that's when I said, that's it. I do not want to be called myself a Christian at all. I really identified as an Exvangelical. And then I started discovering all these online communities and everything. So, yeah, there's tens of thousands, who knows how many people out there that have left the church.
For a whole lot of different reasons, and everybody's journey is a little bit different. There are, I kind of organized the book around different points of cognitive dissonance, whether it's around the evangelical view of other faiths or people of no faith, or the views of, queer people of color. I wrote a whole chapter, talking to some Christians of color who had spent time in white evangelical spaces about the complexity and sometimes the marginalization that they felt there. But for some people, it was politics. And I think that the increasing polarization of the country, of the United States at least, and the deepening identification between the evangelical movement and a particular political project for a lot of people has been a breaking point, at least with using that label. But yeah, I mean, my journey started long ago, but I think that one thing that we all have in common, whatever it is that sort of creates that breaking point or that cognitive dissonance that we then have to sort of explore and resolve in some way, is that I think there's some very common feelings and experiences that go along with it, both because while evangelicalism is a giant subculture, it is a subculture, and there were particular ways of thinking and talking and things that many of us were exposed to growing up, both ideas and types of media and leaders that shaped our consciousness. And so we have this sort of unifying, not identical, but still unifying cultural experience, which I think sometimes isn't talked about enough. As a side note, I mean, religion and culture are like overlapping categories, but they're really similar in so many ways. And then, leaving that world has, I think, people who've left a very restrictive religious environment, whether it's evangelicalism or something else, have a certain commonality. It kind of feels similar on the inside for a lot of people to go through that.
It's a civic religion, isn't it? I've been going through this book. I'm about halfway through. It's called The Evangelicals by Francis Fitzgerald. It's fascinating because the author goes through the history of all the way back to guys like Jonathan Edwards, the Great Awakening and all that. And what has hit me about this sort of history, the narrative, is that American religion and politics and civic life have always been intertwined. So as an American, you're in that soup. You're just in that context, aren't you? It's inescapable. It's just part of the air that we breathe. And living over here in the UK, I've seen, from across the pond, how different it is over here. Massively different than there, isn't it?
It is, I think. I mean, I'm not a historian. I'm not a sociologist. I'm a journalist, and I have my own very narrow, areas of experience. But I will say more than 20 years ago, it's been now in college, did a semester at Oxford. And I came away, was still very much identified as an evangelical. I was going to an evangelical college, and the study abroad semester was kind of through that college in cooperation with some colleges that were more theologically conservative and others that were just small liberal arts colleges. And so during that time, I still very much was in the evangelical world and went to church every Sunday and hopped around different, Anglican churches, because that's not exclusively, but at the time that was about all there was. But I found that within at least the Oxford Anglican churches, they were all a little bit different. And some of them reminded me of almost of Baptist churches at home. Some reminded me more of Catholic churches at home, certainly Episcopal churches at home. But bottom line, like the evangelical flavored Anglican church I kind of settled on, which had, the same worship choruses up on the overhead projector that I would have at home. It was in style so much like home, and yet the theology, or at least the openness to different theology, was different there. And I noticed right away. I mean, there were people at this church that were engaged in like robust debates about things like women in ministry and the inerrancy of the Bible. And so, I don't know. I mean, it's been many years since then, and I'm certainly not an expert on British evangelicalism, but the point is there's more than one way to think about these things. And I think that was probably part of my deconstruction in retrospect.
It's true. Maybe we should begin there and sort of work our way toward the book, because like I said before, we must have a lot in common. We both grew up sort of evangelical fundamentals. What's your story? Can we start there and work our way to sort of what led you to write the book? You kind of alluded to that a little bit, but did you grew up in a fundamentalist home, or was it evangelical? What would you describe it as?
I mean, I think these terms are like, I cite a lot of historians and, sociologists of religion, people like that, because I'm not an expert in, defining these categories. From my standpoint, growing up, we just called ourselves Christians. We didn't use any kind of label like that. I mean, I was vaguely aware of those terms. I think now I think of fundamentalist and evangelical as really being kind of on a spectrum. And I'm sure that, there are entire dissertations that could go into definitions. But I grew up in a theologically conservative Protestant household. We believed that Jesus was the only way to heaven. We believed that the Bible was literally true. We believed that the earth was about 6,000 to 10,000 years old and was directly created by God. We also, and I was taught that in my Christian school as well as in my church. My college even did not teach evolution. I mean, we would talk about it a little bit, but more as something we should be aware of than as something that was actually real. And then certainly, I grew up steeped in the purity culture of the 1990s that was so prevalent. I was a teenager in the 90s, and, purity culture wasn't a new idea, but it sort of reached this, I think it sort of evolved from being kind of an idea that was taught in churches to being like a whole kind of complex of books and, purity rings and events, and that there was like a culture around it, which is why we call it that. So, my church was charismatic. So we believed in, laying on of hands, speaking in tongues, a real sort of emotional, intense, direct relationship to God. My Christian school was part of, I guess it would have been probably more of toward the fundamentalist spectrum. We were supposed to dress conservatively. But I think, you've been around American Christianity, like it's a spectrum. I mean, there were people that went to my school that were more and less strict than my parents. There were other Christian schools in the Kansas City area that were more and less strict than ours. There were some where I think girls, as I recall, like weren't supposed to wear makeup, or people weren't supposed to play cards. At least that was the rumor. That was like the really strict Christian school. And then there were one or two that felt a little more mainstream than ours, like the girls could wear slacks, whereas I couldn't to school. I had to wear a dress to the knee or below.
Yep.
And those are small things, but the theology was fundamentally the same. It was what I just described. It was when I got older and went to Christian college that I discovered, that I learned more about the history of evangelicalism and, the history of like the idea of fundamentalism, which, goes back more than 100 years. And, but we just called ourselves Christians. We believed we had the good news and we had to share it, but we didn't. But we defined that pretty narrowly. Like, we didn't necessarily believe that Catholics were true Christians. We sort of thought they might be, but some of them probably weren't. We were skeptical of mainline Protestants, who didn't seem to have, I guess, in the view of some of the adults around me, enough of an emotional relationship to Jesus. I think that was questionable. And so that was, but it was always attached, aside from the theology, it was always attached to a sort of political and cultural set of expectations.
So was there like a Christian nationalist piece as well? Because that's another big part of the whole narrative that you're talking about. Because I was raised in a very similar context in the Seattle, Washington area, grew up in a Christian church, very, conservative, if not fundamentalist, went to a Christian school, Christian summer camp. I was completely in the bubble, the Christian bubble.
Right.
And one of the big pieces I didn't even know I was imbibing it was all about the Christian nationalists. America was a Christian nation and we're sliding away from the path of righteousness and there's got to be revival and blah, blah, blah. I mean, did you hear that message as well?
Oh, I heard those messages all the time. It was, again, never would have used the term Christian nationalism, but we were taught, and this was one of the things I did for this book was I went and ordered online old copies of my textbooks from school, from Christian school. And I did my best to reconstruct the same. I kind of looked at the covers and I was like, oh, I think I had that one and that one. And
right.
But they were all books from that era by Christian publishers that I know my school used. Some of them I remember better than others. And I really wanted to sort of, not just paint a picture from my own memory, but also have sort of primary source documentation. I wanted to approach this as much as I could like a journalist that I am. And so, it was amazing to me looking back how much our textbooks sort of enforced this very specific idea of, America was a country that was specially sort of ordained by God. It had a special place in world history. And, there was this view of the family that was kind of carefully prescribed. One of the books that I talk about, it talked about like women, the mother going grocery shopping and doing domestic things and the father going to work and the mother supporting him. And all of this stuff was probably not that unusual, 85 years ago or so, but but I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, post
wasn't that long
sexual revolution, and so this was sort of a traditional nostalgic view of American history in which traditional. Would I use that word? I mean, sort of a view of a traditional family paired with a nostalgic view of the United States. And this vision of some kind of, Christian nation. We used, I remember in some of my classes, teachers talking about David Barton, who is really kind of a Christian nationalist historian. He's still very popular today. Yeah. And a lot of his work has been debunked by mainstream historians. He, I think overemphasizes the role of, certainly many of the founding fathers were religious people or Christians, but they wanted to get away from religious domination of the government. That's kind of their whole project. Right. And so, but I was given, a very rosy view of our history, and also a view that really kind of elided, not totally ignored, but I would say minimized the treatment of Native Americans and the history of slavery that were, part of the original sin of our country, as many have said.
Yeah, I've done a lot.
Did you have those kinds of textbooks too? And can I ask in your?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, my mom sent me years ago a pack of stuff that she'd been keeping from when I was in grade school, elementary school, and I went to a small Christian school outside of Seattle, Washington. That would have been the mid 1970s, late 1970s, early 80s. And I went the same kind of experience as you. I went through some of my papers and things that I'd written, fill in the blanks, and I was like, oh my God. This is straight Christian nationalism. This is basically dominion theology. Christians are going to take over the world. Eventually, there's going to be enough of us. And yeah, at the time, I was absolutely imbibing it. because it was my whole reality. That's all I knew. I bought it all hook, line, and sinker. I believed it was all true. And there was no concept of questioning any of it. Did you have that same kind of experience? You're just in that bubble. It becomes normalized.
Yeah, I call it what one of my interviewees called it, and what others have too, which is kind of a parallel universe. I mean, you were really in a bubble. Again, there are Christian textbooks. You go to, Christian school, or many kids were homeschooled. Even for kids who didn't go to Christian school, it was time in youth group. And there's sort of a whole world created for you that kind of carefully curates this view of the world. And I think the idea that Christians have some special knowledge and they're supposed to sort of take control of the government to, restore the United States to some vision of what they think it used to be like, it's easier to not just embrace that, but get excited about it when you don't have a lot of contact with people who are different. And that's part of what my book is about is, for me, there was a lot of cognitive dissonance throughout my childhood, and in large part because of my grandfather, who was an important character in this book, who I don't think it's giving away too much to say, he came out as a gay man later in life. And the book talks a lot about sort of how that reality came into conflict with my family's evangelical reality and the world that my parents were trying to create and the beliefs that they had come to hold and were trying to teach us. But for me, as a little girl, sitting at my kitchen table praying for my grandpa's soul, it was very painful and very scary to think about. It was, on the one hand, it was exciting to think that we had this special connection to God, that we had the truths we were told, that we had, the plan or the vision for how to make a better family, a better society. But the sort of the other side of that coin was that anybody who wasn't in part of that program, was really, going to be punished by God forever. And that included my own grandpa, who I loved. And so for
cognitive
me,
dissonance. Yeah.
Yeah. And for me, it wasn't easy to hold those ideas, all the time. And I struggled with them a lot as a child, even.
So what led you to start deconstructing? Because you were talking about earlier, you were going through this process. It was a years-long thing. One of the things that Dr. Janja Lalit, she's an expert on cult psychology and tactics, she calls it the mental shelf. Everyone has this mental shelf sort of in the back of their mind. And every time you have one of those experiences like you did with your grandfather and some of the belief system, you just put another piece on this shelf. Eventually, it collapses and you can no longer sustain that cognitive dissonance. So what was it that started, other than what happened with your grandfather, what was this process, the journey that you started on?
That's a really interesting metaphor, because I think it's I haven't heard that one before, but I think it's a good one because, obviously you have that shelf and you have those things for some reason, right? Like there's a reason that you want them, but eventually they're doing something for you. And I think that's something that sometimes gets lost. And one of the reasons I wanted to write the book is that people would often ask me, who know about my background and who know sort of who I am today, like, how did you make this journey? Like, how did you get from there to here? Mm-hmm. And like also sort of like the subtext is, why are evangelicals like this? Like, why are they so weird? And I just want to say, it wasn't all weird and it wasn't all bad. And, we accumulated those things, whatever they were. And we sort of built a community and a structure for ourselves that felt very comforting at times. But yes, at a certain point, it sort of buckles under its own weight, because the thing is that it really only works to the people inside of it, and it's very easy to be outside of it. And I think that's a lot of what, a lot of those sort of tension points for me fall into that category, whether it was that relationship with my grandpa, or just learning. The older I got, the more I learned about the world, the more I met people who thought differently. I began to just sort of be curious about what other perspectives were like. And I always had this kind of sense, for example, that what we were being taught about science was a little off. I knew that from a young age, even at church on one occasion that I describe in the book, and at Christian school, and even then in Christian college, like we would be told about evolution and what a threat it was, and how it was something that people believed in because they wanted a reason to reject God. Like they wanted to sin. And so they were looking for a way to pretend that God didn't exist. I don't know. Did you hear that kind of rhetoric about evolution? And I should ask, were you raised creationist? You know?
Yes, oh, absolutely. Yeah, some of those papers that I discovered that my mom sent, it was science lesson that week and how the earth was somewhere around 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And what strikes me now is a lot of it was very conspiratorial in the way it sort of framed the whole discussion. They don't want you to know the truth, that we have the inside knowledge about the earth, that it's actually this much, not billions of years old. They're trying to suppress the truth, and Darwin was evil and all the rest of it. So yeah, that was all part of that same context as probably you were raised in.
Absolutely. But again, I knew a few people, very few people, including my grandpa, who believed in that stuff. And the older I got, like in 8th grade, I was a really cool kid. I was in the National Christian School Spelling Bee.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Wow. I'm impressed right off the bat.
Mm-hmm. It was a goal I worked toward for 4 years. I just have to tell you.
I am really impressed now.
I was very popular.
Yeah.
I finally, we did it. I studied and went through all these. They have all these levels. It's just like the regular, like Scripps Howard spelling bee that you see on TV, but this one was for Christian kids.
Yeah.
And people have asked before, like, was it Christian? I don't know if you have been familiar with this.
The Bible. Oh yeah.
It was not Christian.
Spelling bees.
It was not just Christian words from the Bible, but
spell nonetheless. Spell, yeah, some of the.
Nonetheless, I got to DC for the National Spelling Bee in 8th grade finally, and we went to the Smithsonian's, and it's like everywhere you go in the science-related museums, there's stuff that's like millions of years, and dinosaurs and all this stuff, and like, and I knew that was out there. I had seen some of it before. I think in Kansas City, even growing up, like maybe going to a museum with my grandpa. Like I knew that there was another idea out there, and I gradually began to realize that, like, okay, this is what most people think. This is what scientists think. And also there are lots of people who believe in God that accept this science. And so it was like things like that would just kind of slowly chip away at this world that had been built for me. And I can't say that there was one moment that it all came crashing down. There really wasn't, but it was like a lot of things that just didn't add up. And I mean, for me, I'm still on a journey. Like I'm still incredibly curious about what it's all about and what we're supposed to be doing here. And I think that religion can be really beautiful. And I don't know how, I don't know how you feel about religion on the whole. I think it's done plenty of damage, but I think like the desire for, reaching something bigger and thinking about ourselves in community in relationship to other people is really important. And so, I mean, yes, it all came crashing down in a way, but I don't want to say that it's all for nothing. I mean, I think I can go into this more if you want to, but I think that there's a lot about growing up that way that actually shaped who I am in ways I'm happy about. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of pain with it too.
We're going to resume in just a few minutes with part 2 of this chat with Sarah McCammon. If you haven't figured out where to find her book, don't worry about it. I will put a link in the show notes. It is available right now on Amazon, so you won't have to worry about where to find it if you want to go read this book after we finish our chat. We're going to come back in a few minutes and talk about religious trauma syndrome. We're going to get into some other issues around evangelicalism, deconstruction, community, and we're going to get into how the Trump candidacy campaign back in 2015-16, his presidency, how did that impact specifically on women as far as deconstructing and potentially leaving their Christian faith behind. Just wanted to mention what's coming up here on the next few episodes. I've got a chat with Marissa Hackett. I've finally been able to air these episodes. I've had some of these conversations a few months ago. We talked a long time ago about her growing up in a far-right political cult down in Southern Oregon. So that was an absolutely fascinating story. And then I caught up with my good friend Dean Crosets. He's been on the show before. We had a long conversation about his life, how things have changed so radically for him, especially without God. And that's a really interesting insight into those of us that have left our Christian faith behind. What does life look like now that you're no longer religious? And so look for that chat with Dean. And then finally, I had a good conversation with Keith Giles. I met him through Anna and Carrie Joe of the Heretical Hippies. And so we talked about his new book, The Quantum Sayings of Jesus, Decoding the Lost Gospel of Thomas, as well as a lot of other things around his very radical sort of progressive Christianity. He's found a way to make it work. And so maybe you'll find some inspiration, some insight in this chat with Keith Giles And then I wanted to mention too, real quick, that my book is so close. I've been working with my good friend Tim Sledge. We have rewritten the final couple of chapters, so this is adding a little bit of time to it, but it is going to make it a much better book. So I'm very close. Hopefully it will come out this summer. I've been saying that for a long time, but the work that Tim and I have done on the book, it is making it a better product. So I am very proud of what it's becoming. Hopefully it'll be a real page turner. You won't be able to put it down. So coming out this summer, hopefully my book will finally drop, and I'll let you know when that's going to happen. And then speaking of Anna and Carrie Jo, I was just going to mention we had our final Dismantling Doctrine Zoom call a few weeks ago with Anna and Carrie Jo of the Heretical Hippies. We're taking a break for the summer, but we're going to be coming back. I'm hoping maybe to have Sarah McCammon come back in September. If not, we'll find someone else who wants to drop in. But these are available for Patreon supporters of the show. If you want to support the show financially, you can do that. The links to that are in the show notes. All right, let's get on back into the second half of this chat with Sarah McCammon as we continue to talk about her new book called The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. Yeah, I was going to talk about the religious trauma syndrome piece of it because, as you say, this is what the church does in theory so well. They've got the community. It's built in. And if you want to have a sense of family, a sense of belonging, the best way to do it is just to start attending your local church, if it's, anywhere near healthy or whatever that means. And that's what they do, isn't it? You come in there and they accept you. There's the love bombing piece, and you get invited to people's homes, and it is wonderful. Like you said, I can remember people coming around to help me, and I would help them. When it was time to move house, a bunch of people would show up from the church. And I don't have that as much now that I'm out of the church. I don't have a big community of people around me that help in that way. So yeah, I think there is something there. But what about religious trauma syndrome? Because all the things you were describing, did you experience, now looking back on it, would you say, okay, I have some doses of this religious trauma?
I have been in therapy most of my adult life, and I'm not going to say it's all down to having been raised evangelical. Part of it is just, I think, existing in this world. And I think therapy is a really healthy, good thing. And sometimes I go when I'm feeling fine. I don't want to make it sound like I'm a horribly depressed person, but I have battled depression like a lot of people, I think. I'm not ashamed to say that at all. And for me, along with anxiety, and I think one of the big sources has been, there are, deep religious themes to some of those feelings. When you're told that we have sort of the answers, and we have this insight into sort of why we're here and what we're supposed to be doing, like that sounds great. But I really tried for a long time to sort of implement that in my life. And I think, I still found that, I don't think there is an answer to how to exist. I believe in right and wrong. And I think that I think we should all think about how we treat one another, of course. But the idea that there's a formula you can follow that will make everything work great in your life, as it sort of is sometimes implicitly presented to be in the church, I don't think that works. And I think that when it doesn't work and you try it and you pray and pray and pray to feel okay and to have clarity on, what it is that you're supposed to believe, do, and what's God's will. Right.
It's inscrutable.
I think that can create a lot of pain because for me, there was always a sense of coming up short, of striving spiritually, but coming up short because, maybe because I didn't believe all the things I was supposed to believe or couldn't feel the way I was supposed to feel in church or whatever the case may be. And then there's just I think there's a whole chapter in my book on religious trauma and some others have written there have been a couple of really helpful books and others, I think, works about this topic. And I think it's something that's getting more attention and should. But it can take a lot of different forms. You could do a whole podcast on religious trauma, and I'm just trying to think about how much. Yeah.
I've interviewed Dr. Marlene Winnell and other people, therapists, and who are experts on RTS. So yeah, I've delved a lot into it because I had a lot of it growing up as well, rapture anxiety and all the rest of it.
Yeah,
convinced that Jesus was coming back like a thief in the night, and panicking when I came home and there was nobody home. That creates a huge amount of trauma in a 12, 13-year-old kid's life. It just does, period. I don't care who you are.
There's a sort of trauma associated with the kind of scary, dark theology that some of us are taught. There's the trauma of feeling like we have to save everybody. that's something I read about in the book, is there's just a lot of pressure. Like, you have to behave the right way. You have to be on your best behavior around your grandfather because you have to be a testimony. You have to be a light.
Gotta save him.
Yeah. And I mean, so there were so many ways, that is one example, but so many ways in which I felt like I couldn't, in retrospect, just be a normal kid. And then there's another chapter where I write about focus on the family and James Dobson and the whole sort of a host of Christian teachers and leaders and pastors who taught, that basically the only way to be a good Christian parent was through corporal punishment, that this was, what God wanted. And corporal punishment is nothing new, but we know now from a lot of data that it's really not good for kids. I mean, and it's harmful. It correlates with all kinds of problems. It can be abusive.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it can be abusive. I mean, I write about some of that, my own experiences. I don't think my parents intended to be abusive. I think they were doing what they thought was best for me, but it really caused a lot of trauma down the road for me, and I think for a lot of others that I talk to. So especially when you take physical discipline that is overlaid with this spiritual sort of varnish of like, it's not just like we're hitting you, because I want to be honest, spanking is hitting. It's nothing. It is.
You're actually striking a child with a stick or a spoon or a belt or something, or your hand.
And so you're hitting a child and you're telling them that it's God's will and it's because they're a sinner, and you're having to train them to, and I think that creates a lot of really icky, painful messages that I never wanted to pass on to my kids. Like long before I became a parent, I knew that I would never do that. And I never have, but I talked to at least one person for the book who had, like, she'd started down the parenting journey and had just sort of done what her parents had done, and pretty quickly realized, like, this does not sit right with me. And I am being asked to, like, violate my own instincts as a mother, and I'm not going to do it. And that was kind of like part of her deconstruction. Mm-hmm. So the trauma comes from a lot of different sources. And then, of course, you add to that the fact that some churches stigmatize mental health care. Yeah. One thing I was told sometimes is to pray and take it to Jesus when I felt depressed. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but sometimes we need a little more than that. And
therapy. Sometimes you need medication. It could be a chemical hormonal imbalance. It could be something that simple in a way, rather than praying it away.
For sure. And so I think there could be this sense that, like, if you're not, kind of going back to what I said at the beginning, if you're not feeling the right way, it's some spiritual failure on your part. And of course, in the evangelical way of looking at the world, that carries such a heavy weight to have that feeling about yourself. So, at the same time, you've talked to Marlene Winnell, who I interviewed in the book as well. I think it's tricky because there is also evidence that says that religion, or that correlates, being in a religious community with positive mental health outcomes. And so, I'm not here to say that no one should be religious, but I think for me as a parent, I thought hard about the kinds of religious messages I pass on to my kids and the ones that I decided not to, partly for that reason.
I agree. One of the best metaphors I've heard recently is this image of dosage. It's like going to the dentist. You get an X-ray, and you need to have X-rays to, if you break a bone, or you need your teeth X-rayed or something. But it does do damage to us. But in small doses, we can get away with it. But this idea of, some of us have had higher levels of dosage of religious trauma. Some of us have a lot more to work through. I mean, there's been sexual abuse and all sorts of horrific things that have gone on in the name of God in churches and so forth. That is a massive dosage, isn't it? So again, I think it's true. It's on a spectrum as well, isn't it? And it takes maybe more or less therapy. I don't know. Could take the rest of our lives, Sarah, for us to work through this stuff.
Yeah. And again, that's something that, sadly, we have seen more and more examples of sexual abuse and other types of abuse in churches. I think that obviously the sort of public awareness of it started with the Catholic Church more than 3 decades ago. But we've seen in recent years that the Southern Baptist Convention has had its own scandals and many others. And I think, it's not unique to the evangelical movement or evangelical churches, but anywhere that you have people with concentrated power that's unchecked and questions are discouraged, who are given power, particularly over vulnerable people, including children, these things tend to happen. And healthy communities find ways to try to mitigate them, create mechanisms to avoid, hopefully prevent them, or at minimum hold people accountable, right?
Safeguards, yeah.
Right.
It's true. That's another big one we haven't talked about, the whole sexual abuse scandal. I mean, you're describing the patriarchal system. that's what you're saying, isn't it? That anytime you have, it's usually men who are in charge going down that line. You talk about guys like Dobson. I was raised in the Bill Gothard. I consider it a cult, and I think you mentioned some of this in the book. You talk about the documentary Shiny Happy People, and that's raised a huge amount of awareness over the Duggars and the Bill Gothard thing, the IBLP. What did you find out when you talked to people who were raised in sort of that context? Was that another element of religious trauma syndrome?
Yeah, I mean, that documentary came out near the end of when I was writing the book, so I didn't spend a lot of time on
Right.
IBLP in particular. And I want to be clear that Dobson, to my knowledge, has not been accused of anything like sexual abuse.
No.
And he was a proponent of corporal punishment, along with a lot of others. Of course, Bill Gothard was sued for sexual harassment, and I think the lawsuit was ultimately dropped. But
Yep.
that was like one corner of this world, IBLP and Bill Gothard, which I don't know how many of your listeners know, but that was sort of like a conservative, very conservative movement within fundamentalism / evangelicalism. It wasn't like its own church. It was like I try to explain it to people sometimes because it's not a church. It's not a denomination.
It's a parachurch. That's what we used to call it.
Parachurch, yeah.
Parachurch ministry. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, for me, that movement influenced my church starting around the time I was like in middle school. People started going to these seminars that Bill Gothard would hold all over the country. I remember being taken out of school for a week, I think a couple years in a row at the end, a little bit early, and going down to downtown Kansas City and listening to him speak in these big arenas. And I talked earlier about kind of formulaic thinking, and that was something I think that was really a big part of this particular, people say ministry, but organization was, Bill Gothard really taught, like, if you get it right, if you have the father in charge and then the mother and then the children, and they're all under God's authority, this is how you have a smooth, harmonious family. And who doesn't want a harmonious family?
Yeah.
But it also puts tremendous power in the hands of the patriarch. And, I thought that documentary, Shiny Happy People, was excellent. It was certainly depicting a world or an experience that was much more intense than mine was growing up. But but there was that influence. I mean, Bill Gothard was a big proponent of courtship, not dating, but courtship, which is sort of like even a level or two above just normal evangelical purity culture. It wasn't just don't date and don't have premarital sex. It was like, it wasn't just date and don't have premarital sex.
Too.
It was don't date at all. Just almost
without approval. Yeah, with both sets of parents and chaperone dates and all that kind of stuff.
Right. And that really influenced, a lot of people I knew. It influenced my family a little bit, the way that we approach things. And so, I think for a lot of people, being raised in an environment where your life choices are that constrained, even to how you choose a life partner. And for some people I talked to, that created a lot of damage. And I think you could say trauma because, ultimately you have people getting married very young without a lot of knowledge about themselves and relationships. And, some people I think wound up happy, but a lot of them wound up in situations they wouldn't have chose otherwise.
Yep, that's true. You get corralled into a marriage. Sometimes they're almost seen as arranged marriages. Another element is the stay-at-home daughter movement. That's another thing. So there's a lot of stuff wrapped up in that patriarchal culture. Well, one of the talking points in your book that I think was interesting, you talked earlier about, the community and the sort of seemingly positive things that the church offers. But when people leave, then they have to, work through a whole huge amount of stuff there because they've lost that sense of community. Sometimes you're cut off by friends and family, people that you've been in relationship with for decades, perhaps as part of your church community. What did you find out when you talked to people who had left that? How did they work through that sense of loss?
A variety of different ways. Some people found it in sort of forming, chosen families and new communities, whether it was like through a marriage. Or one person I talked to found a lot of community in the art world after leaving sort of a fundamentalist Christian college and sort of going to art school. This person told me that they were able to sort of find a new group of friends just through shared interests, which I think is something that happens for a lot of people. Some people that I talked to have, everyone navigates their family relationships differently, and that's one of the most challenging and sometimes painful things. For some people, it's about sort of avoiding certain topics, talking around things, sort of reaching maybe a sort of unspoken mutual agreement that we're not going to go there.
We have some boundaries.
a lot of boundary setting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have to.
Yeah. And it's hard. I mean, it's hard because you love your family. You care about them. I mean, I don't think anybody deconstructs because they want to hurt their family. I really don't. And yet I know it's very hard for people. And so it's a challenge. And you're right. A church has a built-in community. Now, for some people, I mean, I've known people who've gone in and found other churches that felt more accepting and more inclusive. And there have been times in my life that's been part of my strategy as well. People land in all kinds of different places.
That's true.
And they cope with this in lots of different ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of different strategies. And I think that's true. For me, it was playing American football over here in this country. That kind of became my replacement for the church I was a part of in Britain, which was ironic because at the time I saw it as a way to evangelize my fellow teammates. I began to realize as I was exiting the church and getting more involved with my local American football team, which actually is a big sport in Britain. It's one of the fastest growing sports here, that kind of became my replacement, quote unquote, church. That was my community. And yet there was no spirituality involved. We were just, engaged around playing sport. But, that you have to find that sense of community, I think, somehow. We need it. We need community. That's the truth.
Absolutely.
We absolutely do.
And that's one of the things that I think sometimes churches tap into and they can do it in more or less healthy ways, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But it's funny you mentioned sports because I, growing up, was not really that into sports. It wasn't something that anybody in my family thought much about. But as I've gotten older, I appreciate it more and more because it is kind of this neutral territory.
Depends on which team you support, I guess, though.
Well, like my family, within my family, there's a range of political and religious beliefs at this point, and there's some tension. But the Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl, and so we were all on the family thread celebrating together, and it's really nice to have those things. I think they're really important for everything. Doesn't have to be about trying to figure out the meaning of life. We can do things that are fun and bring us together and allow us to be just human together and connect because at the most basic level, we all need that, regardless of what we believe or don't believe.
Yeah, that's one thing I've found too, is that just doing things that you love to do. I mean, I play the drums, I play in bands, but I started playing the drums when I was a kid in church with the express purpose of playing in worship bands, playing in Christian rock and metal bands, but I still have that skill. I still know how to play the drums, even though I'm not a Christian anymore. So playing music is a huge, release for me. I call it rock and roll therapy. That's something I've recognized. Like you were saying, some of the things that you walked away from, they're not all bad. You have to take some of the good along with the bad. Yes, there's religious trauma, but those skills and things that we learned while we were part of the evangelical movement, we can still retain some of the positives, I think. It's just sifting through the rubble, sometimes and pulling out. There are good pieces in there, or worthwhile pieces, maybe I should say. Did you find anything like that you felt like, okay, I can salvage some of this?
I think in some ways, the reason that I do what I do, the reason I'm interested in journalism is it's both a complete reaction to and in a way of running away from the church in one sense, but another way it's not. And what I mean by that is I think I was drawn to journalism because it was a space where having questions, asking questions was encouraged. And there was no, if you're doing it right, there's not a predetermined answer. You're supposed to be curious. And it felt so like a breath of fresh air to be in a place where curiosity is a virtue rather than some kind of, bug in the system. I always felt like I was asking the wrong questions on some level in the church. Yeah. And again, that's not all churches that are that way, but that's what my experience was. At the same time, I think one of the positive things that I took away was a sense of, I think I touched on this earlier, but just caring about what's right and wrong, thinking about how we are supposed to treat one another, thinking a lot about, just asking the questions that religion tries to answer. And I think, I think about those things a lot. And I don't know that I have any answers, and I'm much more okay with not having answers than I once was. But I think the fact that I'm, someone who even thinks, who likes to think about those things, and also just I love to read about religion. I love to study it. I'm fascinated by kind of how it shapes people's certainly political beliefs, but also the way they choose to live their lives. I mean, on the most basic and beautiful level, it's about religion or spirituality or whatever you want to call it is about trying to make sense of your place in the world and your obligations to it and to other people. And I think that is something that anybody, theist or atheist can get behind, right? Is just trying to, how are we mindful of our existence and how do we make the most of it? And most of all, like, how do we treat other people around us in the best way possible?
Mm-hmm.
Now, all of that, I think in some ways was shaped by my childhood faith. The way, where I come down differently is I don't feel like I have all those answers figured out, nor do I feel like I have to, nor do I feel like I need to share my views with everybody.
Force them on everybody.
Yeah.
Proselytize the world.
Yeah.
Well, I know we're running close to being out of time, but I did have one last question for you. And that is, you talked about in your book, you were working for NPR covering the Trump campaign or the Trump presidency, I think, for the most part.
The campaign mostly first, and then a little bit of the presidency. Sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. But you talked to a lot of women in particular that were coming out as evangelicals. That was the tipping point, wasn't it? The Trump campaign, the Trump presidency. What was it specifically about the Trump thing for women that sort of maybe triggered that deconstruction moment?
Yeah, I did a piece, I think it was in the fall of 2016, just before the election, about this. And, there were several prominent examples of this. I think about Beth Moore, the writer and author and speaker who was a Southern Baptist and had a very public break a few years ago with the Southern Baptist Convention, in part because of her opposition to Trump. And she and others said things like, I think we're very offended that so many people in their movement were holding up someone who had been, accused of sexual assault and had sort of bragged
incredibly.
Yes, and had bragged about, grabbing women
playbook
quite publicly.
Yeah.
And so I think that was a painful moment for a lot of people. Some I think I interviewed in the book, and others just friends I've talked to. I know I've heard women say things like, "Wow, it was quite a lot to grow up in purity culture and be told to cover yourself and mm-hmm. to, not defraud men," to use a word from the Bill Gothard movement. And then to see some of this, the same sort of leaders and organizations lining up behind someone like that. It felt like, I think for a lot of people, it felt like a betrayal. And that's something I certainly, the sense of what I heard from some of the women I talked to, I think for that story and for the book. But at the same time, there were plenty of white evangelical women who supported Trump. In fact, I think a majority did. So, but yes, I think that was sort of one of the fractures that has started to emerge more powerfully in the last several years.
Yeah, I know for women especially. Here's a guy thrice divorced, and he's no kind of a Christian. But of course, we know my sister. She's
twice divorced.
Oh, that's right.
We fixed that, and yes, an early copy. It was thrice married, twice divorced, and we.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, but just
divorced twice, but he's had numerous affairs and that he's admitted to and bragged about and all that. But yeah, my sister in the States, she's a complete fundamentalist Christian, but she said, "Look, I held my nose and I voted for Trump. We couldn't possibly vote for Hillary, so there was that whole piece there." So yeah, I know it was a struggle, but she stayed fundamentalist, so she's still a Christian. But yeah, it's got to be a hard thing.
And I ran across a lot of people who felt that way, that they were supporting Trump for maybe policy reasons, that his policy positions aligned better with theirs.
Yep.
People like your sister, and this book, I would all say is, Trump was a tipping point for a lot of people, or I think a moment when people began talking more about what it meant to be evangelical than in any time in my life. But people were deconstructing before the Trump movement and will be after. If you look at the data, the long-term trend in America is that white Christianity is on the decline. And that's partly due to demographics, but I think there's some evidence that it's also partly due to the increasing polarization of the country and the increasing intensifying alignment of much of conservative Christianity with a right-wing political project. And so, how that shapes politics going forward is one question I have, but also I'm very curious to see, what it means for churches and for individuals who have to decide sort of what's their place in all of this.
Yeah, where do they go? Well, this has been a fascinating discussion. I know you have to go, but your book is called The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. You can get it on Amazon and everywhere else.
Yep, just The Exvangelicals.
Right. And then one last question. If people wanted to get a hold of you, what's the best place to do it on social media?
I am on Substack, and people can subscribe to that for free. I take paid subscriptions, but I don't require them. And I so far haven't paywalled anything. So mostly I just like to keep in touch with people.
Right. Okay.
And my Substack is called you can Google Sarah McCammon Substack. That's McCammon. And it's called Off the Air. Sort of my side project when I'm not on the air.
Right. That's the best place to find you. Well, listen, Sarah, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing with us. I really appreciated talking to you and getting to know you a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to talk to you too.